Well, I'm sorry for being late. It's been an interesting couple of weeks, but I wanted to hop back in for a little while and give you an update on how things are going. I started my PhD program at Ridley College in New Testament. It's very part-time and very slow, but I have the receipts to prove it and the slightly smaller bank account to prove it as well. We're paying this essentially out of pocket. I'm trying to do it without taking any more student debt on. So thank you, Lord, and thank you for those who pay me. So we are working on that right now. I'll tell you maybe a little more about my dissertation topic, maybe in the comments, or for those of you who know, maybe more about that in a later video. But since we finished my series on entire sanctification, kind of based on my book, I wanted to change it up a little bit. And so I wanted to start a new series on literature for people that are not seminarians per se, or maybe don't have the money to go to seminary, but I wanted to try something a little different. And so this series will be a little bit more book heavy for those of you that maybe can't afford seminary or what have you, but I wanted to try something new. And having gone through undergrad, through a master's degree, and now going through a PhD program, there's a lot I'm kind of picking up. There's just tons of stuff and data and research and just advice in general. So this will be kind of a more practical series, not a ton of exegetical stuff or theology per se. I'm trying to figure out what kind of series I want to do next. But we'll see. Maybe that won't be a series, but maybe we'll go through the Gospel of John or something. I don't know. Maybe put down below what you'd like to see a series on. But maybe Calvinism or Arminianism, or a series on prevenient grace, maybe something like that. I've got an article or two coming out on prevenient grace and a few things on the Gospel of John. Maybe we'll do something on that. But yeah, let me know, comment below, and we'll see what we can do. But I wanted to do something different. So this series, or at least this video, forgive me, I wanted to focus on kind of key resources for studying Paul. Because you may be coming into this going like, I kind of want to go a little deeper. I want to go kind of further into the study of Paul, but I may not have the money, or I may not just know where to start. And so this will be a kind of a key resource, a video on key resources for the beginning of the study of Paul. It's not meant to be exhaustive. It's meant to be very, very brief. So keep that in mind. You may, if you're an expert or a nerd, you may have plenty of thoughts on what other books should be read. These are just 7 or 8 books that I think I would give to any beginner who's looking to study Paul historically and contextually and all that sort of stuff that won't break the bank. So apologies for the beep there. So welcome to Nerdyville. Population, I don't know, my videos tend to get around 60 to 70, so maybe 68 views. Population 68 views. So why this video series? Well, seminary is expensive. I mean, it cost me around $30,000 for my master's, and it'll be about the same for my stuff at Ridley, give or take a few thousand, which sounds terrible to say, but that's kind of how it goes. And I kind of want to cut through the kind of crap that's out there, mostly stuff that's just poorly researched and written, or just basic assumptions that are kind of taken. And this includes me. I'm sure there are many things I assume and take for granted that are false. And just give you kind of a sense of the field, a map of the terrain, if you will, before you decide to go deeper. And I also thought another series might be cool, doing a series that reviews commentaries and suggests which ones the viewer should own, maybe giving a limit of how much money someone should be willing to spend, so for $100 or less, what should you stack your bookshelf with, for a commentary on, that is my son. Nope, we're good. What should you read on the Gospel of John? And maybe getting a few experts on to kind of join in on that. We'll see. But so that's kind of why this video series. And who's this video series for? Well, it's for you. It's for theologically inclined nerds like myself that and undergraduates and seminarians who are beginning their studies. These books might be a challenging read for you, but they are readable and they are respectable and they are serious. They're a serious body of literature for you. And it's for those that maybe don't have an education in this, who want to go a little deeper. So welcome, if that's you. I'm glad you're here. For those who don't know, I'm watching my son, who just went to bed, 1-year-old son, just went to bed, and I'm waiting to see if he'll actually stay asleep. And so this is an introduction to necessary Pauline literature. There are books that focus on, say, justification or the law or women in Paul. This video isn't about those. This video is specifically on kind of general readings in Paul. Just a few books to get you started. We'll talk maybe about what books you should read concerning Paul and gender, for example, Paul and women, or justification, or eschatology, or something like that. So this is more of a general overview. And so the first one is it's a classic in the field, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, a comparison of patterns of religion. This is written by E.P. Sanders, McMaster, Oxford, Duke, all of them. And this book was written in 1977, and the 40th edition that came out recently, within the past, I want to say 10 years, is unchanged from the 1977. So if you see the new edition and you're like, boy, that's expensive, kind of thing, you can find the older edition minus the new preface, the new introduction, for much cheaper. And you can probably find a PDF of it online for free. So what Sanders essentially argued in this book was against the belief that Judaism in the time of Paul and Jesus was a works-based religion. And so you'll think about a lot of what maybe your pastor may have said. He or she might have said something like, the Jews believed they could earn their way to heaven, which kind of smacks of the Protestant Catholic debate over works and faith, which you see in the letters of Paul, specifically Romans 1, 2, and 3, chapters 1 through 3, maybe 4, and James and Galatians, so you see that kind of thing. And agree or disagree with kind of Sanders' analysis of kind of individual pieces of the contested puzzle, he essentially kind of swung the first death blow against the previous scholarship that asserted, largely without looking at first century texts, that the first century Judaism was monolithic and it believed in works-based religion. And that's just not true. And Sanders effectively kind of kills that. The corpse kind of stumbles around and occasionally jerks back to life in certain seminaries, like some more conservative Reformed seminaries that need kind of a foil. It's kind of a boogeyman. But it's an effective death blow. And I would say, by and large, this book, while not maybe the first, you have George Foot Moore, I want to say in the 1920s or 30s, who wrote something kind of similar to this book. But this was the book that everyone read and basically jump started the car. It got the car moving. Issues are, Sanders is still a Protestant through and through, although I think he calls himself a liberal Protestant, and uses words that kind of demonstrate that own presumption on his part. Grace, works. They have kind of a Protestant flair in the way he uses them. But essentially, Sanders was correct in many ways that Judaism was a religion of grace, just like Christianity would say it is. And while there are different ways of conceptualizing that, the two aren't fundamentally at odds in that way. And the conclusion is Paul and Palestinian Judaism effectively challenged a distorted view of Judaism and argued that Jews in the time of Jesus were not modernistic legalists, independent fundamentalist Baptists, for example, concerned with the things that centered on Protestant Roman Catholic debates. So basically, Sanders looked at a lot of New Testament scholarship and was like, y'all are thinking about fighting with Roman Catholics and Protestants, over the past 400 years. That's not the context of the first century. And effectively, while the book is kind of a slog and a lot of what he says about Paul is kind of more contested, it's a book that's worth reading, and it's very easy to read in the sense of terminology and stuff like that, even if it's a bit of a slog. It reads more like a dictionary. But if you can get the PDF for free, the cost is around $30, I think, on Amazon. It's worth getting, and it's worth reading just to get a sense of the immediate past, that is post-Holocaust New Testament scholarship that effectively tried to take seriously the question of Paul and Judaism. So Paul and Palestinian Judaism by E.P. Sanders, a good starting point. The next one is a book that I personally love a lot. And it's not to say it's the best book on Paul, but it's called Paul, A Critical Life, written by Jerome Murphy O'Connor, and École Biblique in Jerusalem. He was a New Testament scholar. And this book was published in 1997 by Oxford University Press, and holds a special place in my heart because I read this book on my honeymoon, and incidentally, about 7 years ago, when my wife and I went to Maui for about a week, a little less than a week. And I allowed myself to bring 2 books. It was this book and one of Jürgen Moltmann's classics, The Crucified God. And I didn't get through much of The Crucified God, but I did get through this book twice. It reads, he has a novelistic kind of flair to it. So he's critical of the book of Acts, but he kind of uses the book of Acts as kind of in his kind of historical reconstruction of Paul. And that is different from, say, Douglas Campbell's book, Framing Paul, which essentially goes, Acts we'll keep separate and see what we can glean just from the letters of Paul, which he takes to be a 10 epistolary corpus of 10 letters, not the full 13, but that's still more than a lot of people will grant. I think you'll have to wait more for Douglas Campbell's view of Paul and Acts. You'll have to wait for a while on that. But Murphy O'Connor incorporates Acts to some extent, and not uncritically, but not uncharitably either. He's kind of an iconoclastic kind of scholar, much like a Gordon Fee or the aforementioned Douglas Campbell. He was keen to kind of run wherever the evidence, he felt the evidence might be leading him, grabs him by the nose and just yanks him, and he just kind of runs with it. And he's got that kind of fire-burning conviction that you like in a writer, and that kind of attitude. It's just kind of refreshing. Someone who basically says, screw it all, I'm going where I want to go with this. And it helps if you have something worthwhile to say, which O'Connor does. He has since passed on into glory. But it's a magnificent book. It reads really well. It's similar to kind of N.T. Wright's new book on Paul. Paul, I can't remember what the exact title was, but Paul a Life or something like that. And while that book is more, I don't like the format of the book, and I don't think it does a whole lot that is kind of outside of what's already been kind of settled on. It's a good book, but this book I feel is a lot more interesting and a lot more refreshing and a lot more willing to be speculative, which I like in a writer. O'Connor, of course, isn't free from kind of Christian theological commitments, but the book reads like good history, and it's filled with all sorts of pizzazz and intrigue, and he's kind of snarky and kind of he's kind of annoyed by a lot of stuff. Like you see, for example, Murphy O'Connor could not believe Paul would say some of the things he said, i.e. about wives submitting in Colossians 3:18. So he kind of just shakes his head at Paul and going like, because he thinks Paul actually wrote Colossians. So he's just kind of rolling his eyes at Paul going like, man, it'd just been really nice if you hadn't said that. So, it's just kind of, it's a fun kind of thing to read. It's not as critical as, say, Richard Purvo's book, The Making of Paul, which is leaving Richard Purvo aside, although I don't think I can at this point based on the stuff he did in his life. Both books are written with a lot of sass and verve and energy and wit, and that's what I like in a book, especially a book on Paul, who's himself sassy and witty and all that sort of stuff. The cost is around $47 USA, but you can probably get it for a lot cheaper. I think it was the listed price on Amazon. And next one is 2. I decided to do 2 for here. You have Paul and the Gift and Paul and the Power of Grace, both by John Barclay. Book 1 was written in 2017. The other book was written in 2020, and both are kind of game changers in their own way. And essentially what John Barclay argues, and John Barclay's at Durham University in England, he argues that grace, or charis, in Paul, and usually he kind of focuses on Romans and Galatians, denotes ancient conceptions of gift giving. And kind of often in New Testament scholarship, we front load a lot of theology words, and we assume a lot about what they might mean. So for example, we think of agape and phileo and all these other words that are usually translated love or affection, have different kind of special meanings. And a lot of New Testament scholarship, if done correctly, kind of challenges modern understandings of ancient words, kind of like how we go Abba meaning something like daddy, and James Barr basically comes along as with all the energy and basically with the temperament of a wrecking ball, basically destroys that argument and goes, no, it's not a special word. And we kind of do this a lot with certain words. And what Barclay does is he points out kind of the economic kind of background or the use of this word, grace or charis, and how that works in social situations and within divine and human reciprocity. And it's a very fascinating conversation that has a lot of interesting ideas and a lot of implications. And Paul and the Power of Grace is like half the size. Paul and the Gift is about 500 pages, but it reads pretty quick. It's technical, but very, very readable. very fresh. And Paul and the Power of Grace is written to be kind of a step below in terms of the difficulty in reading. So he's a very good writer, which I love in Paul. And I can't remember what it is, but the Paul and Wealth School, the school, I know there's a more technical term for it, but there's a big thing in Paul and economics and kind of placing Paul within his economic world. And that usually is coordinate with Paul and slavery and Paul and empire a little bit. But what Barclay does and others do is try to press Paul into where he would be located economically and what that might mean for some of his theology, specifically in 2 Corinthians 8-9, or language of grace and reciprocity and economics in Romans. So we're still waiting to see how the systematic theologians kind of take Barclay's work and other people's work and incorporate it. But there's a lot to be said about this. And so these two books are kind of modern game changers in that sense, in that they, I wouldn't say have swept the field, but they certainly cleared most of the bases. The first book is about $40 paperback, and the second book is about $20 paperback. So Paul and the Gift is 40, Paul and the Power of Grace is about 20. And so the next one is a book that I find very interesting and just a lot of fun, is African American Readings of Paul, Reception, Resistance, and Transformation. And Dr. Lisa Bowens is, I believe she's at Princeton Theological Seminary. And this is a really fascinating book because I'm really fascinated by reception history and how have Paul's letters or the Gospel of John or the Book of Revelation, how have these books been received and interpreted in the church and outside the church? That's a big deal right now. And part of this issue of the study of Paul is that the modern reader is kind of expected to know about a dozen different debates going on before she even picks up anything in Paul. And it's kind of like this. Before you can understand Paul's view of justification, you need to understand Paul's Christology, you need to understand his eschatology, you need to understand his ecclesiology, and all of these things kind of weave together. So if you tug on one, the hand jerks with it, right? It's not as if you can just detach it and be like, okay, I'm going to examine this on its own, and this is this, and then I can just pop it back on my hand, and away I go. It's, everything is interconnected. Pauline theology is a spider web. You pluck one spot, the whole thing shakes. And what I love about this book is that she highlights kind of the debates going on in Paul through reception history, but also just how Paul has been understood by marginalized and oppressed communities. And I have an analogy here. I like this analogy. Reading Paul and all the debates surrounding Paul is the equivalent of being drunk, blindfolded, and shoved into a live minefield while similarly drunk individuals are taking pot shots at you with AK-47s. There's so much going on, even when you pick up Paul, that it's just really difficult to kind of get a sense of where you are in terms of location and literary context. And that's hence part of the reason why I'm doing this video, is to kind of, maybe you won't be as drunk when you stagger through the minefield of Paul, and it's a very well written book. It's very compelling. It's a book essentially about hermeneutics and theology as much as it is about history and our present kind of understanding of race and what's been going on in the Black church and how police brutality and all this sort of stuff is kind of going on. And Bowen's work just really kind of shines a crucial light on that. And you can see it in a more popular level work, Esau McCauley's, I forget the exact, Reading While Black, I think is what it's called, which is a less technical, but similarly intelligent and well-written book as well. I put this one here because I think this book is a little more valuable in terms of kind of more historical analysis, but Esau McCauley's book, Reading While Black, is equally as valuable. And he's also a really nice guy. I met him at SBL and a few other conferences. Very fun guy. So shout out to Dr. McCauley, I think he's at Wheaton College. And the next one is a classic in the field, much like E.P. Sanders' book is. Left hand, so good. And this book is called Echoes of Scripture in the Study of Paul, and the Letters of Paul, And this is written by Richard Hayes, who's, I believe, emeritus professor at Duke Divinity School in Durham, North Carolina. It was written in 1993, so it's a little older. But this book was among kind of the first to kind of like Sanders, reinvigorate the discussion about intertextuality. That is, who in the original text, say in the First Testament or the Hebrew Bible, what about that text inspired Paul to quote it, allude to it, or echo it in his own epistle writings? And how do those two texts that we now have mutually interpret each other? An example might be Paul alludes to the potter clay analogy in Romans 9. But he's echoing the Old Testament. He's echoing, I believe, I can't remember if it's Ezekiel 18 or Jeremiah 18, maybe one of the two, or both even. But he's echoing, he has certain Old Testament texts in mind that he's bringing into the conversation as support for the point he's making. Now, the question then becomes, what do we do with that in Jeremiah? And we'll say the potter clay analogy and the prophets. How does that help us understand what Paul's doing in Romans 9? How do they kind of interpret one another? It won't do, it's not a one, and that's the thing, it's not a one-way conversation, because how Paul explains it might help us clarify and give nuance to what was happening in the prophets. But similarly, how the prophets spoke and their context might influence how we understand Paul. It's like a good marriage. It's about mutual interpretation. And Hayes is kind of not the first, but he's one of the big kind of like the catalyst that got the car running on this question. And it's a really fascinating book. It's a little bit more about method. And it's not to say, it's like same thing with most books. Not everything in there is correct or unassailable in terms of being challenged, but it's a solid beginning work that is technical but readable. And Hayes is similarly got a great command of writing. He's a great writer, and it's a substantial book and a really fun book. And he's a deeply committed Christian. He's a Methodist. He loves Jesus. He cares about the local church, and it comes through in his writings. And so I highly recommend this book. I think it's one of my favorites. I think it's, if you're doing a class on Paul and kind of introducing him, this is one of the main, if you want to kind of get a sense of what Paul is and how Paul reads his Old Testament, this is probably one of the better books on it, or at least I think so. And the cost is pretty cheap. It's about $27 paperback in the US. And that's it. Those are those books. I could pull a few more off the shelf right now. There are plenty of them, but I wanted to stick with about 7 or 8. I think I have 7 in here. But I think, and so here's an analogy. A seminary introductory class, say a New Testament introduction class, at least at Fuller when I took it, I can't remember, it was about 14, 15, 1600. I forget the exact amount, but they can cost anywhere from 1400 to about 2200, give or take. And that's a big chunk of change. And that doesn't include books. That doesn't include kind of miscellaneous fees. And I'm not saying don't pay this to go to seminary. Everyone, in my mind, I wish seminary were cheaper so everyone could go, but not everyone has the time or money or energy or maybe even the need to go to seminary. And I'm very sympathetic to that. As someone who's gone through that, it is, if you're married, it's difficult. If you're single, it's difficult. If you got kids and married, it's difficult. If you got kids and you aren't married, as a single parent, it's difficult. And it takes a lot out of you, and it requires a lot of you. And you may just not be able to do it, or at least at this time. I would encourage you to think about it and pray about it. But reading these books, I think the cost, if I added it correctly, it was about $200 for all the books I mentioned in this video. And if you're kind of willing to invest the time and energy to read those books and are willing to kind of ask the questions that are kind of required to fully understand something or someone, he's still asleep, then beginning with these books, this list, and this is not exhaustive, there are dozens and dozens and hundreds of books that you could read, then reading these books is kind of an essential beginning to theological education and formation within an academic and spiritual context. These books will help you understand Paul in Paul's own words, and also how Paul has been received and interpreted. There's something really important about that, because if you say you decide to go to seminary, you decide to go to Ridley, or you decide to go to Fuller or Truett or Northern, those are kind of the 4 I like. I like those 4 seminaries. I went to 2 of them. If you know the literature and you say you teach yourself Greek and you go through that, you can test out of a lot of courses, but that's not the point of why you do it. It's when you get into this class, you already know what the conversations are, or at least have kind of a paradigm for how to understand things and what the conversations are about and where the conversations have moved, I mean, most people don't really read Paul and Palestinian Judaism anymore because they assume he's right. at least in the broad scheme of things, he's right. And now we're fiddling with the details of the car. The car is already running and moving. Now we're fixing the car up on the fly. But we're not complaining about the car. The car, we're already in the car. And so I think it's a really good way to do reading, to do research, because even if you're a slow reader, maybe you need some extra time, maybe you don't have all the energy that you need to read a book, a book a week or a book a day, you can still read a book, and you can still take the time to read something and to learn something and to grow. And it lets you know that you're not, as a layperson or as a person who goes to church but doesn't know any of this but wants to know, you're not held away from learning and reading. Anyone can learn something. Anyone can read a book. It may take you longer. Like me, I have to read books once or twice just to even kind of get a sense of what's being argued. But I want to encourage you that you don't need to go to seminary to understand some of the big debates happening in Paul, and to be challenged by those debates and to learn more about them and use them in spiritual formation. Going to seminary certainly helps because you have a community involved. You have a specific degree that you're going for, so there's a telos to it. But there's also a telos just to reading a book and learning and just growing and talking about it with your friends, like starting a book group. And so this is not me saying don't go to seminary. It's me saying if you can't afford it and you don't have the energy or the situation doesn't work, read some books and start with these. And I think you'll be so much better off for it. And I try to find books that are not going to break the bank. It's not a monograph that's $100. And but yeah, so I hope this has been helpful to you. If you like what you've seen and blessed you, consider subscribing and sharing it with folks. There's so much to be said about this, and I've only said a little bit. But thank you for watching. And if you've made it to the end, cheers to you. And may the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May his face shine upon you. And as is always said, it never hurts to read a book. So take care and, well, go read. Start reading. It's never too late to learn something. I'm 33. I went to seminary when I was like, what? 6 years ago. So I was in my mid to late 20s. It's never too late to start. One of my mentors at McMaster, she didn't get her PhD till she was, I think, 50 or 60, and she's tenured now. So it's never too late to start. And you start your education, 1, by prayer, and 2, by reading the dang books. So blessings to all of you. May the Lord bless you. Again, may the Lord keep you. Again, may the Lord shine his face upon you. Again, take care and cheers. God is good.